Welcome to Church in My Living Room. I'm so thankful to have you all join me this morning as we read some scripture together and discuss one of the most difficult topics of the human experience, which is suffering. Suffering is something that is not absent in anyone's life. I can say honestly that for me, I have not suffered greatly in much of my experience, and I know that for many who hear messages on suffering, and maybe you who hear this message this morning, when you compare your own experience with suffering to mine, there are these levels. There's a stratification of suffering that surely there are some of you who listen who have experienced suffering much greater than I. But I encourage you to hear out some of my story, but more importantly, hear out David's story, the biblical story, so that you can find in this narrative a common ground, that you are not the only one in your suffering, but you have a friend in David, you have a friend in Jesus, you have a friend in God, you have friends who are brothers and sisters all across the world who share in suffering alongside you, and that there is a way provided forward amidst your suffering into a place in which you might experience the victory that comes only from a life lived with Christ. Suffering for me is something that has not been completely absent, although I've not suffered too greatly. This passage, Psalm 22, about feeling forsaken and forgotten by God, draws me into a moment into my own life just a few years ago, where my wife and I had been married about a year. I'd been a pastor for 2-3 years, somewhere in there at that point, and we learned that we were going to have our first child, and we were so ecstatic, so excited, looking forward to this moment in which our child might come into the world. And shortly after Olga took that test and found out that she was pregnant, I started to have these health issues, and it began to linger in my body more and more, and I began to experience extreme fatigue and felt like my body was slowly breaking down around me. And this is extremely abnormal for me. I've been active my entire life. I've been lifting since before I was even a teenager. I've been a runner. I've always been extremely food conscious. My family was food conscious. And since marrying my lovely wife, Olga, she's absolutely a food Nazi. She doesn't let me eat anything bad. She cuts out my sugar, I'm not complaining. I think she's great. But it's true that we live an extremely healthy lifestyle, something that I think many people would admire if they watch the way that we create habits in our life for healthful living. And so to have this moment in which I started to experience poor health, it was surprising, it was jarring. And slowly it got worse, and I experienced extreme pains, and so much pain that I would just be crumpled over for hours at a time. And so I started to go to the emergency room, I started to go to the hospitals, I started to get blood draws, and the doctors were trying to figure out what was going on. And doctors began to warn me that we can't figure out what's going on, but we're assuming this must mean maybe it's a cancer, maybe it's an autoimmune disease that's being hard to detect. They started walking me through the very serious nature of the things that I was experiencing. And I'll never forget getting one blood draw, walking into this nurse's office, and she said, "I feel like I'm the only one brave enough to tell you this, that you need to get your affairs in order because this thing might take your life." I was floored. My jaw fell to the floor. I was absolutely shocked to hear this. I was in great distress deep in my heart. I tried my best not to show it in that nurse's office, but I was in a lot of trouble. That at that point we hadn't even told anyone that Olga was pregnant with our first child, and yet here I was supposed to be looking forward to one of the greatest moments that a human can experience, the birth of their first child, hoping for this long-awaited moment. And yet here I was wondering if I would even see that day, because I was in so much physical distress, and this sickness was so unknown. And so I remember reading through the Psalms more diligently than I ever had in my life, because I had no words to pray. I had no idea what to say to God, because I felt like God had left me, that I was someone who had devoted, this new chapter of my life to Him, that once I had experienced Christ, I became a pastor. I began to study. I began to do good works in His name. I was preaching the Word as open and often as I could. I felt like I was living a great testimony before God, and I didn't understand how something so great like getting married and having a kid, these blessings that come from God, how those things would be taken away from me if He would allow me to rot in my sickness. And I'm sure many of you in your experience in your life have experienced great pains as well, where you wonder where God is in the midst of your pain and your struggle. David was there. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night I find no rest. David is not immune to the suffering that comes to humankind, that after sin entered the world and Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, there has been suffering ever since, that death was instituted as part of life, and because of that, sickness and unhealth and unrest has entered into the world. David, who is a king, David, who is favored by God, David, who has his own heart after the heart of God, this person is extremely important in all of Israel's history. Surely if there was one who God would keep from suffering, it would be David. And yet we experience it in David's story, that he experiences great suffering in his life. That he's somebody who shows great faith towards God, trust towards God, and God rewards him with a kingship. And yet in the process of becoming a king, he is chased down by Saul, the current king of Israel, all across the back country of the Israel's world. And so he's suffering in that way, but then you see in response to some of the sin patterns of his life, he loses children along the way, and I can't imagine the depths of pain that David must experience when those sorts of events occur. And so David, although he's favored by God, he's not immune to the suffering that comes with the human condition. And he cries out to God, my God, why have you forsaken me? And yet in verse 3, we get this great reversal. He says, yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our fathers trusted. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried and they were rescued. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. When David's faith fails, when he fails to see God, when his eyes are drooped low because of the darkness that surrounds him, because death is chasing him down like a dog after his prey, there is this moment in which he finds that he is not strong enough to lift his eyes to the hills, to the lights. He says, yet you are holy. When David's faith fails, he recognizes God's name is still holy, that his position in his place with God is to still recognize God's holy name. And when he's unable to trust God because of his own circumstances, he turns to trusting on God because of what he's seen God do in other people's lives. That he knows that God has lifted up his forefathers, the generations that came before him. He knows the stories, the biblical stories that played out in the lives of Abraham and Jacob and those who came before. And he says, in those stories, in the God of those stories, in the God of Moses, who raised up a people out of bondage and slavery when they were in darkness, in that God I place my trust. Because if you were good enough, you were holy enough to lift up my forefathers from their darkness, you too can lift me up from mine. And yet this trust, this place of faith in something that came before, does not remove the fact that he's still feeling broken. He goes back into this moment of sadness, darkness. In verse 6 he says, I am a worm, not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by people. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him, and let him rescue him, for he delights in him. It's this back and forth motion of, I'm feeling so broken, and yet I know you are good, but it's so hard for me to see it right now. It's this realness, this rawness of prayer that says, I want to trust in you, but this moment makes it so hard. I feel so broken. I feel so lost. I want to encourage you in our time in this place in two ways. First is that David reveals to us that if you are in a moment of brokenness and hurt and darkness, that you're able to present this to God. That this psalm was so much of a healing balm for me in my moment of suffering, because I saw how David prayed to God and he didn't leave anything out. I know if you're anything like me, I try and leave things out of my prayers with God. That when I go to God, I often clean my face off and I shower up, make sure I smell good, and my language kind of changes to somewhat of like a King James Version prayer. So that way I sound more precise or more professional. But David comes before God with tears in his eye and pain in his heart, and he reveals the realness of a human experience with God. And I want to encourage you in our time that you're able to come to God in this way as well, recognizing him as holy, but also knowing that he hears you in your pain. But the second thing I want to point out is that you are not alone in your suffering. That one of the hardest and most painful experiences in suffering is to feel as if you are alone in your suffering. But David and this psalm are used again in the New Testament by Jesus himself. That this verse 1, my God, why have you forsaken me, is spoken of again by Jesus while he's on the cross. That while Jesus is suffering an extreme death, a painful death for what we believe is your sake and my sake, he looks towards the heavens and he cries out to God his Father, his Trinity. He says, why have you forsaken me in this moment? And then later, this passage, if you read the entirety of chapter 22, it's this constant connection with who Jesus is. What we read in verse 8, he who trusts in the Lord, let him deliver him, let him rescue him, for he delights in him. This can be connected with those who are watching Jesus suffer on the cross, and they say, if he is truly the King of the Jews, then why would God not save him from his cross? In verse 16, you see, for the dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircle me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and they gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. You see this brought up again in the story of Jesus on the cross. All of this to say, the connection between Psalm 22 and the crucifixion story is to draw us into this place in which we recognize that we are not alone in our suffering, but actually Jesus co-suffers alongside us and has also suffered for us. That Jesus has laid down his life for you and for I, that He is a friend, a true friend to us, and what better sign of friendship and of love than to lay down your life for your friends. This is who Jesus is, that He knows your suffering. He knows where you are. He knows the darkness that you're in. He knows the valley of death that you find yourself in. And He does not just say, rise up, but instead He gets down with you in the valley and walks you out into His glorious light. And so I just want to encourage you in those two ways, that you can pray to Jesus out of the realness and rawness of your experience, but also recognize that Jesus has not left you alone in the darkness, but instead has brought the light into the world. I love you, and I hope that you have enjoyed our message together.